Hey, this is Stacy from the future or the past. I don't actually know. I started this with not really understanding how I was going to land that bit, but here we are. Heads up, this episode you're going to listen to today is a re-release, and I will be completely transparent with you. I often re-release these without any intro or note as to the fact that this is a re-release, all of that, all of the time. This is an unusual one because I want you to realize that this was important enough for me to share again. This is an episode I could probably share once a month. This has come up a lot in Q1 of this year as we've sat down with clients for podcast strategy intensives, as we have brought in some new clients to work with us in our podcast production services. There's been a lot of conversation about, well, I've tried to batch in the past and I can't. And the reality is if you're sitting down with me to do strategy work, either in a podcast strategy intensive or as a kickoff for production services with us, you're already one step ahead of batching because there is a real way we make it impossible to actually batch content, certainly in a meaningful, repeatable way. And so this episode is talking all about why you may be struggling to batch right now and how to fix it. And that's what's most important. So I know this is a re-release. I know I'm telling you this is a re-release. Re-listen. Even if you remember listening to this episode, I want to encourage you to re-listen because this is important. It's imperative. All right? Without any further ado, here's the episode. Talk to you next week. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacy Harris. I'm Stacy, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. This is one of those episodes that is kind of always on my mind. It's kind of always something I want to be sharing because frequently I sit down with business owners and they are struggling to keep up with their podcast. Maybe they used to have a podcast and they did it for 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 episodes, but they just couldn't find a rhythm. They couldn't find a way to batch. They couldn't find a way to stay consistent. It just felt hard. And so now they've decided that it's something that's too hard to do, or it's something they really feel called to do. They really want to do, but it's just overwhelming. The idea of sitting down and batching episodes 2 or 4 at a time can feel like a heavy lift. And recently I sat down for a podcast strategy intensive with a client, and this was a couple of months ago now. And this month she sent me a really lovely message, and it said, it was between the podcast strategy intensive and listening to episode 600 of this show, they sent me this lovely message, and it says, I've been podcasting for 15 years. I have heard people talk about the benefits of batching, and I have never felt like I could do this. And I realized, listening to episode 600, why that is. It's not that I didn't have the time or the energy or the focus to produce more than one episode at a time. It was because I was coming up with my content plan one episode at a time. Now that I have a 90-day plan, suddenly batching and all the benefits that attach to it seems not only possible, but logical and inevitable. Logical and inevitable, because when you're batching, we're not just talking about batching, you're recording. And I think this is the real reason you can't batch your podcast, because you only think of batching in the context of getting your show recorded. Because right now, you're probably in a position where you are deciding what you're going to record, outlining what you're going to record, or writing a script even maybe, recording it, and then maybe sending it to an editor if you have some sort of team support where you're sending it to an editor and they're doing the show notes. Great. Which honestly can sometimes make it feel a little easier
to be doing this all at once because you're not doing the post-production work. You're just doing the pre-production and recording work. But how I want you to shift your thinking is that each step of your podcast needs to be batched. Each point has to be done in batches. That includes and starts with, honestly, your strategy and planning time. And this is the game changer. This is the differentiator. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why this is effective, what this can look like, and I'm going to soapbox a little bit. I'm sure of it, because this is such a difference maker in how not only you approach your show, but you feel about your show. Ahead of that, I want to invite you to join me for the Profitable Podcasters Roundtable. We are going to be coming together once again in July to talk podcasting as business owners, how we use this tool. This will be our third time doing this roundtable, and I have had such a blast with it coming together, last month we talked monetization and about an experiment we're going to be kicking off in July. You may have noticed it in the show notes description of this episode or in the email. We have a little buy me a coffee thing. I'm really excited. We'll be talking more about that experiment in future episodes. In fact, next week we're gonna dig into it more, and then I'll be recapping our takeaways from the experiment at the end of Q3. But we're gonna come together as a group. Head on over to uncommonlymore.com/roundtable to come connect with some other business owner podcasters using their show as the core marketing engine in their business and as a meaningful sales conversion tool. And let's chat, let's connect. I'm super stoked. Again, uncommonlymore.com/roundtable to get the dates, the details, and to make sure your seat is reserved. Let's dig in. Let's talk about the difference here. So again, when we traditionally think about batching, we kind of always have this context or this conversation rather in the context of recording, sitting down, doing what I'm doing today, sitting down and recording 3-4 episodes so that I can be ahead for July and we're all good. Everything's done. I can be taking some time off, heading to the beach. We've been doing a lot of that since the sun is finally coming back here at the tail end of June when I'm recording this. But I cannot express how counterproductive thinking about batching only in that context is. And I say this because I've been there. I have done the whole thing one at a time. I have DIY'd my show. I DIY'd my show for years. Even now, I get in times where I have dropped the ball. I have not been ahead enough. And the team, I'm not going to put a late show on their schedule. And so I'm doing the whole thing myself. But it's easy for me to go in and record and edit in one swoop because I already know what I'm going to say. Even in this time of maybe being a little behind the ball, just owning my stuff here, and needing to do it all on my own as far as post-production, I'm able to do that because I'm not sitting down trying to think of what I'm going to say. And honestly, sitting down and thinking, okay, what do I want to talk about? What's on my mind? What do they need to hear right now? Which is always what we say when we think we're trying to think of what they need to hear. But in reality, it's just another way of saying, what can I think of? What's on my mind? What do I want to talk about? Because we're making that decision not based in the data that we're seeing, not based in the trends we see for our show, and not based in the conversations we're having with our leads, not based in the questions our clients are asking us, but now in what can come to my mind right now. What can I think of today? And then we wonder why our show's not effective. And we wonder why it's so hard to batch. Because now we've spent a huge amount of brain energy just trying to think of something to say. And then we go and we try and write it. We try and outline it or script it, depending on sort of our process. And now we're trying to actually record it. So we've exhausted our mental and creative, bankroll there before we ever hit the record button. Before we ever started putting together meaningful, impactful sentences. We've exhausted ourselves. We have tapped our creativity to a point in which the well runs dry just trying to get to the record button. And now you want me to do that for more than one episode at a time? Are you bananas? Have you lost the plot? No, it's just simply not going to happen. Certainly not with any kind of quality. And absolutely not with any kind of consistency. And quality and consistency are going to be critical for conversions. I'm going to say that again. Quality and consistency are going to be critical for conversions. So where are you standing in your own way by thinking about batching as you sitting down and getting 4 episodes top to bottom done? Because that's what's got to change. So what does this need to look like to feel supportive? What does this need to look like to work for you? Here's what it looks like for me and for the clients we work with. We sit down once per quarter and we do all of that quarter's planning at once. That's where the batching starts. Because when we can sit down and say, here's what the next 12 weeks looks like, we can do 2 things. One, we can buy you space and time if and when you need it. For example, when I sat down to do Q3, which we're kicking off with this episode, I knew I was going to need space and time at the front of this month, where here in the States, we've got some time off. And I knew we would be kicking off, we're kicking off the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. I knew I'd need some space. So we took a couple weeks off. I'm not releasing episodes those first couple of weeks. You may have noticed that as you're listening to this episode now. Then we roll into a few new episodes, which I am recording today. And then August is going to be a lot of re-releases. And we've talked about this before. And if you're joining me for the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind, we're going to talk about this a lot. This is what we're talking about in month 2. But we have a whole series. Now, we've got some new episodes we're rolling in there too, which again, I'm recording this month with my July batch, because we'll kick off that series with a new episode. And then I'm re-releasing my core series I have built to be re-released in this way when I need it. And then we'll come into September with some fresh new episodes, because that's when I can look at my data and see that's when our listenership kicks back in. I can look at my historical purchase data and say, this is when our clients start showing back up. This is when our sales start tipping back up. Is that last month of Q3 as I go into Q4 planning with our production clients. So I have all of those episodes planned. But most importantly, I have started by going, where can I put some stuff here to buy me space, time, and capacity? Which brings us to the second thing we can do. We can focus that creative capacity we have, interweave it with the data and the trend information we're looking at from past quarters and past years, and put it all into building the best, most supportive content for our audience for that, I'm going to say season. I don't mean that in the like we only run a show seasonally way, but in this season of the year, in this time of the year. So what's the most supportive content I can be creating with what I know about where they are right now? Again, I come back to something I mentioned just a second ago. I know people kick back in September. I also know August is our slow month. I also know for the people who are tuning in and listening to the show, for the people who are engaging with the content, they're also doing a little bit of their own sort of like housekeeping, which is why that series that runs in August that's coming up next month is called the Podcast Housekeeping Series. Because for the people who are tuned in, for the people who are plugged into their businesses this time of year or that time of year, in this season of the year, they're looking at gearing up for Q4. They're looking at how am I setting myself up for the tail end of this year, for the last sort of push of this year. And this is one of those things they're checking in with. And if they're not currently, they should be. And so that's why I want to share it with them. But I can do that because I'm free to use up every last bit of my creativity and my insights, because I'm not also recording here. I'm not even scripting or outlining here. Now, I will in this planning session generally put a working title and some bullet points, which often ends up being 50 to 80% of my final outline, just because I'm not a scripter. I'm a riffer. I'm an outline and go kind of girl. That's just my style. That's just my process. I've shared this before. There's episodes that are more heavily scripted than others. But I'll put together some thoughts. What are the 3 points I want to make? So I've got a working title and 3 points. Cool. So then when I sit down to batch my planning time, which I also do on another section of time. Sometimes it'll be the same day. Sometimes I will, especially now, I've been doing this so long. The show turns 10 this year. We've done 600 plus episodes. I've been doing this a while. I produce a dozen other shows. Like, I've been doing this a while. For me, it comes down to getting this out pretty quickly. And so oftentimes I will do all of my planning, and then if I still have the capacity, my strategy, I'll then go into my planning time. So I'll go into, cool, let's prep these for recording. And I will flesh out those outlines and start doing some title optimization, which will help me do some of the SEO keyword planning and things like that, so that I can try and bring some of that into the actual episode itself, into the transcript itself. And so I'm looking at, often back to back, having those maybe 2-3 hours be all of my strategy time and all of my planning time for 12 weeks of episodes. So now in the course of a couple of hours, I have everything ready for me to sit down and record. And that's why on days like today, I'm able to sit down and knock out 4 episodes I will do 4 episodes in less than 2 hours. Because my episodes are only usually about 20 to 30 minutes long. And I don't need to make time to plan. I don't need to make time to prep. I don't need to make time to pull my thoughts together. I'm just sitting down and saying words. I see my bullet points. I see the points I need to make. I'm an expert in what I do, so I know what I'm saying. And so I say it. That's it. So now I've managed to get at least 4 weeks of episodes completely ready for my production team, completely ready for my editor, my show notes writer, my transcriptionist, my scheduler in 5-6 hours. Which means if you sort of map this out over a quarter, I spend, 8, maybe 10 hours a month, or a quarter rather, on my podcast. So that's it. That's the strategy. That's the prep and planning. That's the recording. That's everything. And then the show gets released, and it works. Because I went through each of those steps with intention. I made those decisions not based on vibes, not based on how I'm feeling right now, but instead on the data of sort of the reality of my show. I'm able to review my notes from sales calls and from client sessions so that I can make sure I'm speaking to what's relevant for them right now. What is right now for them, not for me. Because this show is not about me. This show is not a place where I get to come and talk about whatever I want to talk about. This isn't my show, it's yours. This show is for you. It is to help move you to what you want next from your show, from your business. Now, will you absolutely get everything you need here? Probably not. And that's why it's a sales tool and not an education format. That's why for this client who I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, who sent me this message after 15 years of podcasting and being very good at this, still books quarterly sessions with me where we can sit down together, separate ourselves from what feels good to talk about, what feels top of mind, assess the data for what's been, think about where we're going and what is going to be, and make a plan for what needs to happen, not just what feels good to talk about today. I want you to shift the way you approach batching. It doesn't start with recording. It starts with your planning. This is why the most important work, in my opinion, that we do with our production clients is those 4 quarterly calls. The most important part of our contract, the most valuable part of our deliverable are those 4 calls a year where we sit down and we plan. We look at what's been, we look at what we want to be, and we figure out what needs to happen. Because then they can go and they can just record. And I will be honest, we absolutely have clients who don't batch their recording. They record 1 episode, maybe 2 episodes a week. Because that's how they like to flow. But they can do that, and that can be supportive and productive and work well for them because we do batch the strategy. Because we do batch the planning. So batching the recording doesn't actually matter because they stay ahead of schedule because they're never sitting down and wondering what they should say. They're never sitting down and going, what the hell am I going to talk about? They know not just what they want to talk about, not just what they're going to talk about, but what needs to be talked about and why it's relevant now. Do you know how much easier it is to sit down and riff when you understand why you're riffing about the thing you're riffing? It's exponentially easier. And that's what I want for you. And that comes from batching that strategy and planning portion. Skipping this is costing you so much time, so much money. But most importantly, so much mental capacity. Which, time and mental capacity for me are my most important assets. They are the 2 things I do not waste. Blame it on the ADHD. But if my brain is working the way I want my brain to work today, if my brain is working in a way that is focused and is clear, I want to use that for all it's worth. I want to get as much done as I can. I want to leverage that to the high heavens. And I can't do that if I'm trying to just figure it out as I go. I can sit here and honestly, essentially hyper focus on recording and tune everything else out because I'm not going to get distracted by going to look at my data. I'm not going to be distracted by opening up my notebook from recent sessions and trying to figure out what might be relevant to talk about. I'm not going to be distracted by scrolling my inbox looking for questions from clients or scrolling through Monday.com where our dashboards all live looking for questions. I'm able to open up my recording software and go. That's it. That's incredibly valuable for me. And I promise it will also be valuable to you, ADHD or not. Because the clarity that comes from having this strategy in place is what gives you the confidence to sit down and say the damn thing. The thing you talk about with your colleagues, the things you talk about with your friends, the things you vent about to your mentors, the things that everybody in your life is saying, you've got to be talking about this. They need to hear this. Because you can step into that because you have prepared yourself to feel as good as you can feel in putting those thoughts together and sharing them. Because you've given yourself the space, the time, and the mental capacity to show up and do it. That's incredible. That is where the power of this comes from. That's what makes this work. All right, I'm putting away the soapbox. I hope this sold you on batching your strategy. Please tell me it did. As you're sitting down, we're just starting Q3. Do this for Q3. It's not too late. You don't know, okay, well, I'm definitely going to do that for Q4. Time is made up. Do this for your next 12 episodes. I don't care what amount of time that covers. I don't care what 12 weeks that cover. I don't care if it falls in. We're not waiting till Monday. Okay? Sit down and plan your next 12 weeks. And if 12 weeks feels like too big of a lift, plan your next 8. Plan your next 4. That's the minimum. Okay? Plan your next month. Sit down and go, what do I need to record in July? What do I need to have ready for August? But batch this planning time. And if you need support to do this, if this feels like too big of a lift to do alone, because it is a big lift to do alone, that's why podcast strategy intensives exist. So that you and I can do this work together. So head on over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive and reserve your time now, or reach out and we can have a conversation about what this looks like for you. I'll see you here next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.